There are moments in life that do not announce themselves as permanent while they are happening. They arrive disguised as something small, ordinary, almost forgettable. A phone vibration, a short message, a few sentences typed quickly, perhaps in anger, perhaps in exhaustion, perhaps in a moment when emotions outran reflection. And yet, when those words are read, something inside fractures. Identity shifts, belonging trembles. The meaning of family, once assumed to be solid, suddenly feels conditional. This is the power of words when they intersect with irreversible moments. Words are not neutral. Educational psychology shows that language does more than communicate information. It constructs reality. The way we understand ourselves, our relationships, and our place in the world is shaped largely through language. From childhood, words tell us who we are: loved, wanted, disappointing, invisible, valued. Over time, these messages settle into identity. So when a single message arrives carrying rejection or severance, it does not merely deliver news. It rewrites the internal story a person has lived by for years, sometimes decades. A message that ends a relationship is especially powerful because it collapses complexity into finality. Human relationships are layered, filled with contradictions, history, shared memory, and unresolved emotion. A short text reduces all of that into a conclusion: we're done. In educational terms, this is cognitive compression, the human tendency to simplify overwhelming emotional material into absolute statements. But while the sender may feel temporary relief in this simplification, the receiver experiences shock. The brain struggles to reconcile years of connection with a few definitive words. This mismatch creates psychological disorientation. Belonging is one of the most fundamental human needs. Research consistently shows that social connection is not a luxury, but a requirement for emotional regulation and mental stability. Family, in particular, functions as a primary anchor of belonging. It is often the first place where identity is affirmed. You belong because you exist. When words withdraw that belonging, the impact reaches far beyond hurt feelings. It threatens the basic sense of safety. The nervous system reacts as if something essential to survival has been removed. This is why people often describe these moments as life-altering. Not because the words were eloquent or dramatic, but because they redefined the relational ground beneath their feet. One sentence can reposition a person from inside to outside, from participant to exile. Educationally, this shows how language establishes boundaries of inclusion and exclusion. When those boundaries shift abruptly, the psyche enters a state of alarm. Words spoken in pain often carry this destructive power because pain narrows perspective. When someone is overwhelmed emotionally, their language becomes more extreme, more absolute. Nuance disappears. Instead of saying, "I am hurt," the message becomes, "You have ruined everything." Instead of "I need distance," it becomes, "Never contact me again." In the moment, these words feel accurate to the intensity of the emotion. But emotions are temporary states, while words, once delivered, can become permanent records. The educational lesson here is that words create memory. Even if reconciliation happens later, the original message does not disappear. It lives on as a reference point in the mind. The receiver may forgive, but the nervous system remembers. Trust, once destabilized by language, takes significant time and consistent behavior to rebuild. This is why irreversible moments are often linguistic rather than physical. No door needs to be slammed, no objects need to be broken. Language alone can sever bonds. Identity is especially vulnerable in these moments. Many people define themselves through their roles: parent, child, protector, provider, guide. When a message rejects not just behavior but the relationship itself, it can feel like an erasure of self. The internal dialogue shifts from "I made a mistake" to "I am fundamentally unwanted." Educational frameworks distinguish between guilt and shame here. Guilt focuses on actions, shame attacks identity. Words that end relationships often trigger shame because they imply that the person, not just their behavior, is unacceptable. This is where long-term damage can occur. Shame has a silencing effect. It makes people withdraw, doubt their worth, and question their right to belong anywhere. Over time, this can influence how they show up in other relationships, more guarded, more anxious, or emotionally distant. A single message, then, does not stay confined to one relationship. It ripples outward, shaping future interactions and self-perception. Family relationships intensify this effect because they are intertwined with history. Words spoken within family contexts carry accumulated meaning. They echo past conflicts, unspoken disappointments, and long-standing patterns. When a family member uses final, rejecting language, it often reactivates earlier wounds on both sides. The message feels heavier because it is not heard in isolation, it is heard through years of shared experience. Another educational dimension is the illusion of control. When people send decisive messages, they often believe they are taking control of a situation that feels unbearable. Cutting off contact feels like reclaiming power. However, language does not only exert control outward, it also shapes the sender's internal world. Once words are spoken, the sender becomes accountable to them, even if emotionally they later shift. Pride, fear, or the need to appear consistent can prevent repair, turning a moment of pain into a long-term separation. For the receiver, the irreversible nature of such words creates a unique grief. This grief is not only about loss, but about sudden redefinition. The past is reinterpreted through the lens of rejection. Moments once remembered as loving become questioned. Was it ever real? This cognitive reevaluation is exhausting and destabilizing. Education helps us understand that this is a normal response to relational trauma. The mind searches for coherence when meaning collapses. Words spoken in pain also tend to eliminate dialogue. They close doors rather than open conversations. Educationally, communication is meant to exchange information and build understanding. When language is used to terminate rather than communicate, it stops learning on both sides. No further clarification is possible. No growth can occur within that relational space. The silence that follows is not peaceful, it is filled with unanswered questions. Yet understanding the power of words is not about assigning blame alone. It is about cultivating responsibility. Emotional responsibility means recognizing that feelings are real, but the language we choose to express them matters. Pain does not justify permanence. Anger does not require absolutes. Education in emotional literacy teaches that we can express boundaries without annihilating relationships. I need space is not the same as I am done with you forever. One leaves room for repair, the other declares finality. For those on the receiving end, another lesson emerges. Words spoken about you are not always truths about you. They are often reflections of the speaker's internal state. This does not erase the pain, but it prevents total self-collapse. Learning to separate identity from rejection is a critical skill for psychological survival. You can acknowledge the impact of the words without allowing them to become the sole definition of who you are. Irreversible moments teach us that language should be treated with caution, especially in moments of high emotion. Once sent, words cannot be retrieved. Apologies may follow, explanations may come, but the original impact remains part of the relational record. This is why education around communication emphasizes pause. A pause allows emotion to settle and language to regain proportion. Ultimately, the power of words lies in their ability to create worlds or destroy them. They can reinforce belonging or exile someone emotionally. They can preserve complexity or reduce relationships to final judgments. Understanding this power is not merely academic. It is practical wisdom. It reminds us that in moments of pain, restraint is not weakness, and silence can be a form of care. For those who have lived through such irreversible moments, the educational task becomes integration. The words cannot be erased, but their meaning can be contextualized. Identity can be rebuilt on values rather than validation. Belonging can be redefined as something internal as well as relational. And while the family bond may never return to its previous form, the individual can learn to live without being permanently defined by a single message. In the end, words matter because they last longer than emotions. Pain passes, anger cools, But language, once released into a relationship, becomes part of its history. Understanding this truth is what transforms suffering into insight and loss, into a deeper awareness of how carefully and compassionately words must be chosen, especially when everything feels like it is falling apart. Grief is usually understood as a response to death, something marked by rituals, shared language, and social permission to mourn. There is a body, a funeral, condolences, and an accepted narrative that something has ended. But there is another kind of grief that is far more confusing and often more painful because it offers none of these anchors. It is grief without closure, the experience of ambiguous loss where someone is gone from your life but not gone from the world, absent yet still alive, unreachable yet vividly present in thought. This kind of loss disrupts the mind in ways that traditional grief does not, because the brain is designed to seek endings, explanations, and meaning. Ambiguous loss occurs when separation happens without death, without explanation, and without a goodbye. A relationship ends suddenly. Contact is cut off. Silence replaces connection. The person you love continues to exist somewhere, but no longer in your emotional or relational world. Educational psychology explains that the human mind relies on clear categories to process experience: alive or dead, present or absent, here or gone. Ambiguous loss violates these categories. The person is physically alive but psychologically absent. This contradiction confuses the brain and prevents grief from completing its natural cycle. In traditional grief, pain has a direction. There is sadness, longing, and eventually a slow integration of loss into memory. With ambiguous loss, there is no clear path forward because hope remains suspended. The mind keeps asking, will they come back? Should I wait? Did I misunderstand? Is this temporary? This constant questioning drains emotional energy. The nervous system remains on high alert, unable to settle into acceptance because acceptance feels like betrayal of the relationship itself. One of the most distressing aspects of grief without closure is the lack of explanation. Humans are meaning-making beings. When something significant ends, the brain searches for reasons to stabilize the event. Explanations help organize memory and reduce chaos. When no explanation is given, the mind turns inward. It begins to fill the gaps, often with self-blame. What did I do wrong? What did I miss? If I had been different, would this have happened? Over time, these unanswered questions can erode self-worth and distort identity. Educational frameworks distinguish between loss that is acknowledged and loss that is invisible. Ambiguous loss is often socially invisible. There is no public recognition, no shared mourning, no socially accepted script for how to grieve someone who is still alive. This invisibility compounds the pain. The person grieving may feel isolated, confused, or even ashamed for feeling such intense sorrow over something others might minimize or misunderstand. They're still alive, people say, as if that erases the loss. The absence of a goodbye is another critical element. Goodbyes serve a psychological function. They allow emotions to be expressed, meanings to be exchanged, and transitions to be marked. Without a goodbye, the relationship feels unfinished. Conversations replay in the mind, searching for missed cues or unresolved moments. This mental looping is the brain's attempt to complete a story that was cut off mid-sentence. Educationally, this is known as incomplete processing, where the mind repeatedly revisits an event in an effort to resolve it. Ambiguous loss also disrupts identity roles. When someone disappears emotionally, the roles connected to them lose their clarity. A parent without a child's presence, a sibling without contact, a partner without acknowledgement. These identities become unstable. The person grieving may ask, "What am I now?" This identity confusion is a central feature of grief without closure. The loss is not just of the person, but of the self that existed in relation to them. The mind struggles, especially with time in ambiguous loss. In clear loss, time moves forward. Anniversaries pass. Memories soften. With ambiguous loss, time feels suspended. Each day holds the possibility of contact, reconciliation, or explanation. The future cannot be imagined clearly because the past is not fully settled. Educational psychology notes that this temporal disruption contributes to chronic stress, as the brain cannot predict or plan when uncertainty remains unresolved. Another layer of complexity is the coexistence of contradictory emotions. Love and anger, hope and despair, longing and resentment can all exist simultaneously. In traditional grief, emotions tend to follow a more recognizable arc. In ambiguous loss, emotions fluctuate unpredictably. One moment, there is acceptance. The next, a surge of hope triggered by a memory or a thought. This emotional instability is not a sign of weakness. It is a natural response to uncertainty. Grief without closure also challenges the concept of forgiveness. How does one forgive without understanding what happened? How does one release resentment when there has been no accountability or explanation? Education teaches that forgiveness in ambiguous loss is less about absolving the other person and more about freeing oneself from emotional captivity. It is an internal process, not a relational transaction. This reframing is essential because waiting for the other person to provide closure often leads to prolonged suffering. The body often carries this unresolved grief. Sleep disturbances, fatigue, tension, and unexplained physical symptoms are common. The nervous system remains activated because the loss is not clearly defined. There is no signal that danger has passed or that mourning can conclude. Educational models of trauma explain that the body needs clarity to relax. Ambiguity keeps the system alert, as if something important is still unfolding. One of the most painful aspects of ambiguous loss is the erosion of trust in relational stability. If a significant relationship can disappear without warning or explanation, the world begins to feel unpredictable. This can lead to hypervigilance in future relationships, fear of abandonment, or emotional withdrawal as a protective strategy. The loss extends beyond the original relationship, shaping how the individual engages with others. Healing from grief without closure does not mean forcing acceptance or pretending the loss does not matter. Education emphasizes the importance of naming the loss accurately. Calling it what it is, ambiguous loss, validates the experience and reduces self-blame. It acknowledges that the difficulty in moving on is not due to weakness, but due to the nature of the loss itself. Another critical step is shifting the focus from external closure to internal coherence. External closure depends on the actions or explanations of the other person, which may never come. Internal coherence involves creating a personal narrative that allows life to continue meaningfully despite unanswered questions. This does not require certainty. It requires self-compassion and permission to live fully even while ambiguity remains. Rituals, even private ones, can help. Although there may be no funeral or goodbye, individuals can create symbolic acts to mark the loss. Writing letters that are never sent, acknowledging the relationship's significance, or setting intentional boundaries around rumination can provide structure to grief. Education shows that rituals help the brain transition between states, even when the transition is symbolic rather than literal. Over time, the goal is not to eliminate hope, but to redefine it. Instead of hoping for reunion or explanation, hope can shift toward emotional stability, self-respect, and future connection. This redefinition allows the individual to release constant waiting without closing the door entirely in their heart. It is a delicate balance, but one that restores agency. Grief without closure ultimately teaches a difficult lesson. Some relationships end without resolution, and some questions remain unanswered. The human mind resists this reality, but growth often requires tolerating uncertainty. Learning to live with unanswered questions is not resignation, it is resilience. It means acknowledging pain without allowing it to dominate identity or future. In the end, ambiguous loss reshapes the understanding of grief itself. It reveals that mourning is not only about death, but about disappearance, silence, and unresolved endings. It challenges the belief that every story has a clear conclusion. And while it may never fully make sense, it can, with time and care, be integrated into a life that continues to hold meaning, connection, and the capacity for love, even in the presence of unanswered questions. When a relationship breaks down, especially one that once carried deep meaning, the mind instinctively looks for somewhere to place the pain. Responsibility becomes a frightening concept because it is often confused with guilt, shame, or self-punishment. Yet responsibility, when understood correctly, is not about condemning oneself or absolving others. It is about developing emotional maturity, the ability to look honestly at one's own role in relational dynamics without collapsing into denial or self-destruction. This capacity is one of the most challenging and transformative skills a human being can develop. Emotional immaturity tends to operate at extremes. On one end is denial, the refusal to acknowledge any personal contribution to the breakdown. On the other is self-annihilation, the belief that everything is one's fault, that one's character is fundamentally defective. Both positions protect the ego in different ways. Denial preserves a sense of innocence by externalizing blame, while self-destruction preserves a sense of control by assuming total responsibility. Neither leads to growth. Emotional maturity exists in the difficult middle, where complexity is tolerated and truth is examined without cruelty. Educational psychology emphasizes that responsibility is not about assigning percentages of fault, but about understanding patterns. Relationships rarely collapse because of a single moment. They erode through repeated interactions, unmet needs, miscommunication, and emotional habits that go unexamined. Reflection asks not, "Who caused this?" but "What did I consistently bring into this relationship, and how did it shape the outcome?" This question shifts the focus from judgment to learning. One of the first obstacles to healthy reflection is shame. Shame tells a person that if they look too closely, they will discover something unforgivable about themselves. As a result, the mind either avoids reflection entirely or engages in it in a harsh, punishing way. Emotional maturity requires separating behavior from identity. You can acknowledge that certain actions, reactions, or patterns were harmful without concluding that you are unworthy of connection. This distinction is essential because growth cannot occur in an environment of self-hatred. Another obstacle is defensiveness. When pain is intense, the nervous system prioritizes self-protection. Defensiveness narrows perception and turns reflection into a courtroom where the goal is acquittal rather than understanding. Educational frameworks on emotional regulation explain that defensiveness often masks fear, the fear of being wrong, rejected, or seen as inadequate. Recognizing defensiveness as a protective response rather than a moral failure allows it to soften, making honest reflection possible. Responsibility also requires acknowledging intention versus impact. Many relational injuries occur without malicious intent. People often say, "I didn't mean to hurt you," believing that intention should absolve them of responsibility. Emotional maturity recognizes that impact matters regardless of intent. Understanding how one's words or actions were experienced by another person does not invalidate one's own perspective, it expands it. This expansion is a sign of psychological growth. Reflection becomes destructive when it turns into rumination. Rumination is repetitive, circular thinking that replays mistakes without generating insight. It feels like responsibility, but it is actually self-punishment. Educationally, productive reflection is forward-looking. It asks, "What can I learn?" rather than "How can I punish myself?" Emotional maturity involves knowing when to stop analyzing and start integrating what has been learned. Another key element is recognizing one's emotional patterns. Many people repeat relational behaviors learned early in life, often unconsciously. These patterns may have once been adaptive, strategies for survival, belonging, or control, but become maladaptive in adult relationships. Reflection involves identifying these patterns without judging the younger self who developed them. This compassionate curiosity allows change without erasure of one's history. Blame shifting is another defense against vulnerability. When the pain of loss feels unbearable, focusing on the other person's faults can provide temporary relief. While it may be accurate that the other person contributed significantly to the breakdown, exclusive focus on their behavior leaves no room for personal growth. emotional maturity does not require minimizing the other's responsibility. It requires refusing to let their actions define your own capacity for self-examination. Responsibility also involves accepting limits. Some relational breakdowns occur despite genuine effort and care. Reflection may reveal that you showed up with the best tools you had at the time, even if those tools were insufficient. Emotional maturity allows for this nuance. It acknowledges imperfection without demanding omnipotence. You are responsible for your choices, not for controlling outcomes. One of the most difficult aspects of reflection is tolerating uncertainty. There may never be full clarity about what went wrong. Different people experience the same relationship differently. Emotional maturity accepts that multiple truths can coexist. Your understanding does not have to match the other person's for it to be valid. This acceptance prevents endless searching for a single, definitive explanation. Responsibility also extends to emotional regulation during conflict. Many relational ruptures are not caused by disagreement itself, but by how emotions are expressed under stress. Reflecting on moments of emotional flooding, where anger, fear, or hurt overwhelmed the capacity for thoughtful response, can be uncomfortable. Yet this examination is crucial. It shifts focus from what was said to how it was said, and how emotional intensity may have escalated rather than resolved conflict. Another educational insight is the role of boundaries. Sometimes relational breakdowns occur because boundaries were unclear, inconsistent, or violated. Reflection involves asking whether you honored your own limits and respected the limits of others. Emotional maturity recognizes that boundaries are not punishments or withdrawals of love. They are structures that allow relationships to function sustainably. Self-forgiveness is an essential outcome of responsible reflection. Without it, insight becomes another form of self-harm. Self-forgiveness does not mean excusing harmful behavior or dismissing its impact. It means acknowledging wrongdoing, committing to change, and allowing oneself to remain human in the process. Educational research shows that self-forgiveness is associated with greater empathy, resilience, and relational repair in future connections. Responsibility also means choosing growth over vindication. The desire to be proven right can be powerful, especially after rejection or loss. However, vindication rarely heals. Growth does. Emotional maturity prioritizes becoming wiser over being justified. This shift changes the internal narrative from who was wrong to who am I becoming. Over time, reflection leads to integration. Lessons are absorbed into values, communication styles, and emotional awareness. The relationship may not be restored, but the individual emerges more capable of intimacy, accountability, and resilience. This is the quiet reward of emotional maturity, not the absence of pain, but the presence of understanding. Ultimately, examining one's role in relational breakdowns is an act of courage. It requires facing discomfort without flinching and resisting the urge to either disappear into shame or harden into blame. Responsibility, when practiced with compassion, becomes a source of strength rather than punishment. It allows the past to inform the future without imprisoning it, and it transforms loss into a teacher rather than a verdict on one's worth. Rejection has a way of hollowing out meaning. When a relationship ends without repair or explanation, it can feel as though the future that once gave structure to life has been erased. Purpose, once anchored in connection, collapses. Dignity feels questioned. Inner stability, which quietly depended on belonging, begins to shake. Rebuilding meaning after rejection is not about pretending the loss does not matter or replacing it quickly with something else. It is about learning how to live fully again, when reconciliation may never come, and when hope must be redefined rather than abandoned. The first rupture caused by rejection is existential. Human beings organize their lives around relationships. Roles, routines, and identities are woven together with the people we love. When rejection occurs, especially from someone deeply significant, the mind does not only ask, "Why did this happen?" It asks, "Who am I now?" Meaning is destabilized because the reference point that once guided decisions, values, and dreams is suddenly absent. Education in psychology shows that when meaning collapses, distress intensifies, not simply because of sadness, but because life feels unmoored. In the early phase after rejection, the instinct is often to pursue restoration at any cost. Dignity is quietly sacrificed in the hope that proximity will restore belonging. Repeated explanations, apologies, or attempts to prove worth can feel like survival strategies. Yet these efforts often deepen the wound when they are met with silence or rejection. One of the most difficult educational lessons is learning that dignity must be protected even when the heart longs for repair. Dignity is not pride, it is self-respect in the face of pain. Inner stability cannot be rebuilt while one's sense of worth depends entirely on another person's response. As long as reconciliation remains the sole measure of healing, life stays on hold. Education teaches that this creates emotional dependency, where well-being is outsourced to an outcome beyond one's control. Rebuilding meaning begins when the focus shifts from what might return to what can be cultivated internally, regardless of the other person's choices. Purpose after rejection must be reconstructed rather than resumed. The old purpose may have been relational, defined by care, responsibility, or shared future. When that purpose disappears, it leaves behind a void that cannot be filled by distraction alone. Meaning-making research shows that purpose is restored through contribution, growth, and alignment with personal values. This does not erase grief, but it provides a reason to keep moving through it. Dignity is rebuilt through boundaries. After rejection, boundaries are often blurred by desperation or guilt. Learning when to stop reaching out, when to stop explaining, and when to allow silence to exist is not an act of coldness, it is an act of self-preservation. Boundaries create psychological space where healing can begin. They also communicate, first and foremost to oneself, that worth does not depend on being chosen. Rebuilding inner stability also requires mourning the fantasy of reconciliation. This is one of the most painful steps, because hope has often been the last thread holding life together. Letting go of guaranteed reconciliation does not mean closing the heart completely, it means releasing the demand that healing must come through reunion. Education frames this as flexible hope, the ability to remain open to possibility without being consumed by expectation. Identity must also be reassembled. Rejection often reduces a person to a single narrative, the one who is left, excluded, or cut off. Over time, this narrative can overshadow every other aspect of self. Rebuilding meaning involves expanding identity beyond the loss. You are not only the one who was rejected, you are also someone with values, skills, curiosity, and the capacity to contribute. Purpose grows when identity is diversified, rather than confined to one relational wound. Daily structure plays a surprisingly important role in restoring inner stability. Rejection disrupts routines and erodes motivation. Days become heavy, unstructured, and repetitive. Educational psychology emphasizes that small, consistent actions can re-anchor the nervous system. Regular movement, creative expression, learning, and service provide predictability where emotional life feels chaotic. These are not distractions, they are scaffolding for recovery. Dignity is further strengthened by choosing self-compassion over self-criticism. After rejection, the inner voice often becomes harsh, replaying perceived failures or inadequacies. This voice believes that punishment will lead to improvement or redemption. In reality, self-criticism drains energy and narrows perspective. Self-compassion, by contrast, supports resilience. It allows a person to acknowledge pain without being defined by it. Education shows that people who practice self-compassion are more likely to grow from adversity than those who rely on self-blame. Rebuilding meaning also involves redefining connection. Rejection can create a fear of future attachment, or a belief that closeness inevitably leads to loss. While caution is natural, total withdrawal impoverishes life. Inner stability grows when new forms of connection are built slowly and intentionally. These connections may not replace what was lost, but they remind the individual that belonging is still possible in varied forms. Purpose is often rediscovered through service. Helping others does not erase personal pain, but it contextualizes it. It shifts focus from what has been taken to what can still be given. Education highlights that contributing to something larger than oneself restores a sense of agency and value. Service affirms that one's existence has impact beyond the relationship that ended. Another crucial element is meaning-making through narrative. Humans understand their lives through stories. Rejection can freeze a story at its most painful chapter. Rebuilding meaning requires continuing the narrative. This does not involve rewriting the past, but reframing it. Instead of "this happened because I was not enough," the story becomes "this happened, and I am learning how to live with integrity and strength because of it." Narrative flexibility is a cornerstone of psychological resilience. Inner stability is also supported by accepting permanence without despair. Some relationships do not return. Some silences do not break. Education teaches that acceptance is not approval, it is alignment with reality. Accepting that reconciliation may never come allows emotional energy to be redirected toward living rather than waiting. This acceptance unfolds gradually, often unevenly, but it is essential for forward movement. Rebuilding dignity means choosing values over validation. Validation depends on external affirmation. Values are internally generated. When choices are guided by values such as honesty, kindness, growth, and self-respect, life regains coherence. Even in the absence of reconciliation, one can live in a way that feels right. This alignment restores a sense of integrity that rejection often damages. Over time, meaning after rejection becomes quieter but deeper. It is no longer dependent on being seen or chosen by a specific person. It emerges from self-trust, contribution, and the courage to remain open to life despite uncertainty. The pain may never fully disappear, but it no longer dominates identity or direction. In the end, rebuilding meaning after rejection is an act of profound resilience. It is choosing to live with dignity when love was refused, to cultivate purpose when a future was taken away, and to build inner stability without guarantees. Reconciliation may never come, but life does. And within that life, meaning can be rebuilt, not as a replacement for what was lost, but as an expansion of who one becomes in its absence.